A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome once again to HJN Super Graphics, of which it's time to finish things off, once and for all, with the Dark Picture series. It certainly wasn't enough that I had to spend an entire summer in the year 2023 showcasing my playthroughs of all 4 games that currently exist. Well, excluding Switchback VR. And then of course there is the upcoming Directive 8020, which we still have yet to get because it's currently not released. However, that's alright, because we're going to be focusing on Dark Pictures, The Devil in Me for number 2588. The last of the series so far. A quadrilogy of horror games which focuses on the multilinear perspective, a gameplay style of which that it allows for you to branch off different paths, make different choices, and allow for certain people to either live or die. And that's been the running theme of all of the games thus far. They all basically came as a large wave which rode off the direct success of 2015's Until Dawn, which, believe it or not, was another product of Supermassive Games. But thanks to their partnership with Bandai Namco, the duo were able to crank out 4 games within a good total of 4 years. And that's a lot to work with. But in terms of The Devil in Me, remember when I talked about House of Ashes in its more realistic format? The fact that it actually took place in a real-life situation? The American-Iraqi War that was going on in the year 2003 was pretty well done in this instance. But have you ever wanted to learn about the first ever serial killer of the United States? Yep. Howard H. Holmes, or H.H. Holmes for short, was a man in particular whom was described as the first serial killer of America. And as far back as between 1887 and 1897, he had supposedly made anywhere between 20 and 200 murders, which ultimately ended up getting caught by police, sentenced to death by hanging, and of course you might be familiar with Josh Slavin's review on his actual last meal. Eggs, toast, and coffee were what he had before he died. And of course there was that brutal struggle against the ropes. 15 straight minutes he sat there before he finally croaked. But in this case though, Dark Pictures The Devil in Me, like all the games, does cue us off with the curator walking into the room set into that famous rock song. And let me tell you, the rock song in particular was pretty well done for what it is. But let's be real here. The curator does cue us in on a certain story that centers around H.H. Holmes and a certain scenario in which it depicts a supposed event that transpired during the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. Of course, when I've actually heard about announcements surrounding the 4th game supposedly taking place in a realistic environment, I practically figured that it would have been based off of something of the more colonial variety. But as I've discussed before, a 1970s incident in Little Hope with a house fire did transpire into the current events that was Little Hope itself. And it turns out that as far back as colonial era days was when Little Hope itself was becoming heavily victimized by such things like witchcraft and demonic torture. Yeah, it was horrifying beyond belief. But how does The Devil in Me stack up? Well, as you probably know by now, H.H. Holmes is more or less an essentiality to the plot itself, because the opening scene does in fact take place during the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Unfortunately, not much of Casey Jones was featured, but we do at least get a good shot of a certain couple whom we're hoping to get a good afternoon of some quality time in a nearby hotel. And then of course there was the lobbyist who was inside, the man whom was able to escort them into their room and get themselves comfortable and well situated. But little did they realize, it was Holmes himself. And Holmes was basically keeping him there for some sort of master plan. You see, the building in particular that Howard H. Holmes had put together was a massive mixed-use building. A commission that he did as far back as the mid-1880s, in which that it became known as the castle. While it definitely did not look like a castle, it was an incredible building for the time period that it was made, partly because a number of things went down in the design process. The most important thing was that this building was made to carry out all sorts of false conceptualizations. I mean, supposedly there was hotels, a barber shop, certain other businesses that would have preoccupied the building itself. The place is supposed to be a mixed-use faculty, so of course it would have served possibly dozens of purposes. But the real big thing that it ended up doing was only serving as the last possible stop for anybody that walked inside. And as Holmes did greet them when they came inside and got themselves situated, nobody realized that they were actually being followed, stalked, and then hunted until the very last breath that they took. Of course, while we do know that it all ended with Holmes getting caught, the game does basically fast forward to the modern day, in which that there was actually a group of filmography students. Much like the other games so far, The Devil in Me basically had 5 main protagonists. Unless, of course, you're also willing to count the curator. He is the recurring character of all games, and is the man responsible for organizing the stories and entrusting us players to complete the job for him. Of course, one thing that I will mention is that the 5 personnel that are involved, they aren't just any film students. The thing is, you have yourself Kate Wilder, whom is played by Jessie Buckley, and is, believe it or not, depicted on the front cover. In the same regard as how we had Conrad in the first game, Andrew in the second game, as well as Ashley Tisdale's Rachel in the third game. But we basically have Jessie Buckley on the cover. And I will say that Buckley is a really familiar name to me, in the same way that how Tisdale and Ashmore were also pretty well represented in my lifetime. I was basically reeled into these games mostly because of certain actors coming around and portraying themselves in the games. And as for the others, you have Charles Lonnet, played by Paul Kaye, Mark Nestor, played by Fahinti Balogun, Jamie Tiergan, played by Gloria Obiano, as well as Aaron Keenan, played by Nikki Patel. For the most part, while we are in fact set in the modern day era, October of 2022, the game itself does in fact lure us to an eventual point where the students are hoping to find the supposed replica of the castle itself. And as we know, while the building itself took a long time to build, this replica supposedly remained unknown. And this crew was hoping to get a good first-hand look at what the building was like, being that this was built to scale and built according to what the actual blueprints were first like in the 1880s. Because after all, while we do look in further into the past of H.H. Holmes with his confession saying, "I have the devil in me," which likely is how the subtitle, "The Devil in Me," came around. So, it's nice that they were able to use a quote from a real-life serial killer, but not just any, the first ever American serial killer. I would almost wonder if they were going to make a straight-up sequel to this. Could it be based off of Ed Gein? Ted Bundy? Or possibly anybody else? Who knows? In any case, though, the real fun technically starts after some loops that I have to make through, as well as jumping through hoops, to get inside the actual building. And the guys are in fact ready to have some quality time, much like the victims that we saw in the opening prologue. But let's be real here. In the same regard as how that unfortunate couple ended up getting murdered, so are this crew of 5. And supposedly, there was a man inside whom technically does act like a certain hotel employee whom is willing to allow for them to make their stay. But as we all know, the castle was more than just some giant building. It was a huge labyrinth, as the design process showed, and a Q in particular showed a nice graph of the floor in particular, in which it was like a big maze. There were staircases that led to nowhere, there were a bunch of dead ends, and there were even some doors that took him to random spots which weren't exactly of intuition. It was more or less just some sort of game to Mr. Holmes himself. But in all seriousness, when we do get to the big point in which that the true horror begins, well, I might as well just give away some of the facts at hand. And while not everybody in this game is exactly a great actor, Jessie Buckley really does know how to reel in us fans. I've seen several of her works in the past. And the thing is that she is an investigative journalist and the actual host of the film in particular that the crew is hoping to create. A documentary in particular known as Architects of Murder. And it turns out that the castle of H.H. Holmes was their next exposition that they were hoping to shoot. But apart from all that, you basically have some of the other guys involved. I mean, Charles, for instance, while he is the eldest of the bunch, one big weakness that he happens to have is an extreme habit for cigarettes. But we'll get back to that shortly. And as for the others, I will say that they do have their own reasons of being who they are. I mean, Kate has an ex-boyfriend alongside her. At the same time, he is meant to be the true cameraman of the group, and the others mainly coordinate the likes of wording and sound. So you definitely have yourself a team that is well-trained and well-rounded and hopeful enough to create such a big documentary like this. But let's be real, Architects of Murder definitely could have been called something like The Truth of Murder or something, because let's be real here. That so-called hotel employee at the building that they were staying at for the night does turn out to be a bit more than just some guy inside. Yeah. Basically, when everybody's up and around, things start to go down pretty quickly. This guy, whom is all around, apparently has a mask on, and we don't even know who he is. But that's supposedly the big thing about it. He's a mass killer, supposedly dressing himself up like the actual H.H. Holmes, as if he was some sort of reincarnation of the killer. And I can probably understand that from a certain perspective. I mean, it's terrifying to learn the idea of what the heck is Ted Bundy doing out there today? Or maybe if somebody were to believe in the idea of reincarnation, what could he look like? And more importantly, would he actually carry on some of the same things that he used to do before his own execution took place? Oh, but you know what? All of these things here are just a bit of a distraction. Because soon enough, the crew members do get separated. It's kind of like how in the other games where eventually the 5 would split apart and end up in completely different areas of the place in particular that they're exploring. I mean, you got Man of Maiden, in which it's a giant ship, Little Hope, in which it's a certain abandoned town, once known for certain horrifying events. In House of Ashes, there's a giant network of caverns that leads to some sort of ancient temple. And here in The Devil in Me, it's a giant replica of the actual castle that H.H. Holmes had constructed back in the day. So, it's safe to say that the idea of giant locations becoming little more than claustrophobic pieces of mind are more than just a major component in all of the Dark Pictures games. In the same way as how you have a group of 5 as the protagonists of the game, linear-driven storylines, and a curator played by Pip Torrens, whom shows up every now and then in the game to let us know about our progress, and to also let us know about what we did, as if we need to remember about what happened. Anyways, though, the real trouble starts to brew, because, unfortunate as it sounds, let's just say that Erin doesn't exactly happen to have good health. She does need an inhaler. And the killer, believe it or not, catches up to her and apparently offers her inhaler back, which she lost for some reason. But you know what I did? I went ahead and attacked him instead. Because who knows what that inhaler could have been laced with. It could have had poison in there. It could have had gas in there. It could have had drugs in there. Something that likely would have killed her, or at least caused her to be incapacitated enough, so that way this killer could have actually taken her down easily. So, you know what happened then? He actually did kill her. Right on the spot. Wow. I actually felt bad at that point. But how the heck was I supposed to know the difference between taking an inhaler or just attacking the guy? Like, I mean, why would he even offer her the inhaler anyway? Is he trying to kill her, or is she trying to tease her? Well, whatever the case, that arc comes to an end with Pip scolding me for getting Erin killed. And as for the other remaining survivors, from Kate to Charles, well, let's just say that Charles ends up in a not so good spot, because just as we discussed before, he happens to be a bit of a cigarette addict. And what do you know? There happens to be cigarettes in a certain room with a large door. He goes inside, at least from the choice that I put together, and boom, the door locks behind him and the killer is looking at him through the viewing port. Yeah, I guess you could say this guy is doomed. Even worse, the room in particular was an actual component of the castle itself, the crematorium. This is supposedly how Holmes himself had disposed of some of the bodies that he had tortured or mutilated to death. And it's very likely that even if he did commit such a high body count, as high as 200 people, it's likely that a good majority of the bodies could have been put in here, in the crematorium. And unfortunately, Charles would become the next victim. However, rather than try to bust down the door, I end up taking cover underneath the floor, because he basically pulls up a vent and then crawls inside while the flames fill up the room above. I almost wonder, just as I'm seeing him, it's like he's suffering from either the heat or even the smoke that's filling the room. I guess you could say that's as closest to a smoke it he would ever get. But what do you know? Little to my knowledge, he actually survived it. Yeah, instead of trying to bust down the door, I went ahead and went under the flames. I actually didn't realize that that was the correct choice to prevent him from dying as well. And keep in mind, this was just a little while after Erin got killed. And as for the other guys, well, we could say that Kate was holding off on her own, being the supposed leader of the group, while Charles was more or less of an addict of some sort. And as for Mark and Jamie, well, they were able to hold on to their own as well. We'd see Mark around with his camera that he mainly uses as a light, which is pretty clever, if you ask me. It kind of reminds me of the Outlast games, the way that your character holds a camera and that apparently is the only way to shine light ahead of you in whatever claustrophobic hallway you're in. Jamie's a pretty witty one, just the same. I mean, we're navigating through libraries, going outside, near the pool, going near the garden, and then near some hedges. It's just a nice big network of things that we happen to explore, all the while occasionally getting jump scared. But you know what? The jump scares in this fashion are actually well crafted, but they are of some of the simpler things that we could have done. I mean, you got the killer moving subtly across the screen. That causes us to be jump scared. Then there's a bird that shows up. Yeah, that's as simple as we could have taken it. Imagine if it were something else, like a certain thing creaks or something drops on the floor, accompanied by a dramatic sting. That could jump scare us even further. But again, it's just an impressive note that in the evolution of jump scares ever since Five Nights at Freddy's came out, that we've certainly come pretty far backwards, if you ask me. It ain't about animatronics trying to invade your office at this point in time, nearly 10 years later, but instead, a bird flying upward in front of you, or a guy walking in front of the camera. I guess it's not very intuitive, but I still do appreciate the idea that they managed to make them jump scare effective enough for us. Anyways, though, let me talk about the real amazing thing. The ending. While Jamie unfortunately died, or actually Aaron was the one that died, Jamie and Mark, alongside Kate and Charles, are able to make their way over to a nearby boat. Cops end up stopping them. The killer comes not far behind and takes them both down, and then eventually gives them to the water just as the guys are trying to make an escape from it on the boat. And then while the killer tries his best to take everybody out, the combined efforts of the crew and their bravery and courage ensue so well, the killer is tied up in a chain and then dragged under. Oh man. Shredded to bits with the propeller. Wow. Talk about a creative kill. It's kind of like the mixture of Syndrome's death in The Incredibles and Makarov's death in Modern Warfare 3. The original, of course. You know, chained by the neck and sucked into a propeller-like object. You know, that combination is pretty satisfying, if you ask me. In the same way that both deaths were satisfying, this was also satisfying. Probably even more so than the others. Just goes to show that modern media could possibly be even better than the classics. And for all accounts, the story of H.H. Holmes revitalized for a new generation, remade for a new era of people, and re-nightmared for an incredible day of terror. Where a modern day H.H. Holmes attempts to make his way to kill 5 collegiate filmmakers, well, it's safe to say, The Devil in Me truly nailed it out of all the ones so far. But as we know, one other thing still stands by: the credits and epilogue. Of course, we see the survivors get out of the water and are eventually found by rescuers. They are taken through the documentary shows on TV, and eventually there was a certain song that plays during the credits, supposedly depicting animatronics that were present throughout this castle replica inside, as we had seen them before in a few different ways. This song in particular is known as "Oh Death." And it was a unique way to wrap up the series. Along with the credits rolling, it truly was quite the opportunity. And of course, knowing that it was New Year's 2023 by the time I finished the whole thing, I really ought to say, this sure was a nice piece to look back upon 2 years later. But since we have Directive 8020 on the line, and the fact that the teaser trailer really showed us just how crazy space could be, that's why I'm more than excited to know what could we possibly encounter in that game once it gets released. Of course, there are supposedly 3 other games that are meant to take place afterwards. So what are Bandai Namco and Supermassive Games going to do for the other 3? I guess we'll have to wait and find out. But all in all, The Dark Pictures, The Devil in Me was almost masterpiece quality. The fact that it had the decency to give us an inside look at the first serial killer of the States, known as H.H. Holmes, and revive him in a modern day perspective, that alone is incredible. A serial killer with a lot of bodies and quite the reputation of pretending to be some sort of helpful man out there on the streets of Chicago. And on top of that, the whole idea of going to the supposed castle replica was just for a film project. That's a lot of bravery that you'd have to go through just to get that far. Of course, wouldn't you know, there was an actual castle replica that we do have nowadays. And I'm sure if anybody would visit it, it hopefully doesn't turn out like it did back then. Or even like in this game. But you know what? All this just makes me more excited for what Directive 8020 could give out. But until that happens, my overall scoring for The Devil in Me is at a rather high 8.9 out of 10.1. So almost perfect for what it is. And I do get the feeling that Directive 8020 shall not disappoint either. So with that in mind, thank you for enjoying this whole perspective on the 4 installments of Dark Pictures. If you're wondering about Switchback, I probably won't have much to say, since I do have yet to play it, or even mention it. So of course, with that in mind, this conclusifies my entire perspective on the Dark Pictures series. And if you want to see more, go down to my channel. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.